Hmm. Remembering. That's what the Sufi tradition calls their worship, zikr, to remembering, being remembered. We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote. You remember this, I imagine. To affirm and promote, we covenant the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. Acceptance of one another. And encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. A free and responsible search for truth and meaning. The right of conscience. The use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. The goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. Respect for the interdependent web of all existence, of which we are a part. Remembering a covenant. You know, these principles, they are not the whole of Unitarian Universalism. They're not a dogma or a doctrine. They're not a litmus test of belief to determine whether one can belong among us. They do not speak of actually so many important aspects of our theology, of our theological inheritance. They don't talk about what we have to say about ultimate questions of good and evil, about how to talk about God, about the meaning of suffering, about what happens when we die, about questions of salvation, of forgiveness and redemption, of grace, of love. The principles aren't our theology, but they are our covenant. And they aren't our covenant actually as individuals, but as a congregation. As a congregation, we covenant to affirm and promote these principles, along with over 1,000 other Unitarian Universalist congregations in our association. We covenant to the other congregations. We will affirm and promote these things. And it's a covenant we inherited, most of us, but not, in fact, from time immemorial. We inherited this covenant from 1985, when the seventh principle, respect for the interdependent web of all existence, of which we are a part, 1985, that principle was added. It was the year before I was born, so, you know, not that long ago. I know there are a few of us here who were members of this congregation or other UU congregations then. Perhaps even some who participated in that renewal and reshaping of our covenant at the General Assembly in 1985. I'm looking at you, Dick. You'd have to dig further, you and some others, to find the covenant that you first inherited in becoming part of this faith. But most of us, like me, we inherited the covenant as it stands. And I think this is important to remember about covenant, that we always inherit it before we choose it. You might have heard me talk about the way my teacher, Rebecca Parker, longtime president of our seminary, Starr King, describes covenant. She says, at its simplest, covenant means to come together. More precisely, it means to come together by making a promise, as when two people promise to love and care for one another. But she explains that in this coming together, we receive who we are before we choose who we will become. We are born into relationships before we shape them by our conscious intention. Born into relationships before we shape them by our conscious intention. And it's tempting, especially in our culture, to take this big idea of covenant and shrink it down to a size we can understand. And I think when we do that, we sometimes make it too small. Sometimes we take this big idea of covenant and shrink it small enough to feel like we're in control of it. This is how Parker puts it. She says, Unitarian Universalists often speak of covenant as a verbal statement of promise between individuals who, exercising their freedom of choice, bring community into being. Individuals making a promise together bring this community into being. She says there's historical reasons why we think this way. It's an expression of the dominance of an individualistic understanding of human existence. First comes the individual, then the community. But our times demand that we think in other ways about the relationship between the individual and the community. The limits of a merely individualistic understanding of human existence are pressing upon us. Our attachment to an economic system that maximizes self-interest has broken our covenant with the earth and with one another. Our broken covenant with the earth and with one another. You know, there is a long and storied history of covenants getting broken. In a way, that whole story of the Hebrew Bible, where the Western cultural roots of our understanding of covenant begin, it's the story of the covenant between God and the people getting broken over and over and over again. God gets mad and floods the whole world, has to recovenant with the world, gives Noah the rainbow sign. Generations pass and the people have lost touch with God. The descendants of Noah don't know the rituals and practices of their ancestors, but not Abram, who would become Abraham. Not Abram, he holds the faith, and God crafts a new covenant with Abram, renaming him, renewing and renaming him Abraham, nation builder. Creating a covenant of nation building, of human greatness, of building enduring legacies. But the blessings God promises do not endure. The people find themselves not a great nation, but enslaved in Egypt. Not prosperous as Abraham's descendants were to become. And through Moses, the covenant is renewed once more, a covenant that was about how to be as a people. A covenant that bound a people together through 40 years of wandering the desert. A covenant that said, look, we are a people because we hold these truths together. We together hold these things to be sacred. Each of these covenants, imperfect, sometimes gravely so, and yet renewed, remade to hold a people through challenging times. Time and again in these old stories, God and the people, they fall short, they lose tempers, they break the covenant, and it must be repaired, renewed. And each time it changes, shifts to embrace how things are now. Covenants get broken, covenants can be repaired, covenants can be renewed, must change, adapt, evolve, to be renewed. And it's important to note that each time the covenant is repaired and renewed in those old stories, they don't start over from scratch. Each generation is born into that covenant already in place. Again and again, we find the covenant we have inherited is not adequate for the challenge of our times. We find in the metaphor of this poem by Sister Joyce Rupp, the old maps no longer work. So I keep pulling it out. The old map of my inner path. I squint closely at it, trying to see some hidden road that maybe I've missed. But there's nothing there now, except some well-traveled paths. They have seen my footsteps often, held my laughter, caught my tears. I keep going over the old map, but the roads now lead nowhere. A meaningless wilderness where life is dull and futile. Toss away the old map. Toss away the old map, she says. You must be kidding, I reply. She looks at me with Sarah eyes. She looks at me with Sarah eyes and repeats, toss it away, it's of no use where you're going. I have to have a map, I cry. Even if it takes me nowhere, I can't be without direction. But you are without direction, she says. So why not let go? Be free. So there I am, tossing away the old map, sadly, fearfully putting it behind me. Whatever will I do, wails my security. Trust me, says my midlife soul. Trust me. No map, no specific directions, no this way ahead or take a left. How will I know where to go? How will I find my way? No map? But then my midlife soul whispers, there was a time before maps. There was a time before maps when pilgrims traveled by the stars. It is time for the pilgrim in me to travel in the dark, to learn to read the stars that shine in my soul. I will walk deeper into the dark of my night. I will wait for the stars, trust their guidance, and let their light be enough for me. Old maps no longer work. We reach the point in inner journeys time and time again. We reach the point in our collective spiritual journey, finding the old map of 6 principles inadequate to live our growing understanding of interdependence. We reach the point in our wider society's journey when the maps, the institutions, the pillars we have relied upon to guide and sustain our democratic ideals no longer suffice. When that kind and wise midlife soul, that deep, dear friend, looks at us with Sarah eyes, eyes of that matriarch, spouse of Abraham, the nation builder, Sarah, who must give up all hope of bearing a child, gives up all her maps of how things were supposed to go before she finally gives birth to Isaac. So as we scramble to find reassurance in the falling pillars of democracy, she looks at us with Sarah eyes and repeats, toss it away. It's of no use where you're going. I read an opinion piece recently by a historian, a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, Joseph Ellis, about, well, he didn't use these words, but about the renewal of the covenant of our democracy. And he began the piece with a story from the early days of forming our democracy, a story you might be familiar with, or at least one line of it. He tells the story of a group of Husky prisoners coming from the Philadelphia jail, carrying Benjamin Franklin on a stretcher back to his quarters after attending the last session of the Constitutional Convention in early September of 1787. Says this grandfather among the founding fathers was afflicted with a serious case of gout, but he had attended every session during that steamy hot summer, and a well-dressed Philadelphia matron spied America's elder statesman and asked, "Mr. Franklin, what have you done?" "Given you a republic," Franklin replied, "if you can keep it. If you can keep it." The right of conscience and the use of democratic process within our congregations and in society at large, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. Holding on to this republic, it's not been a given. Ellis argues that there have been two occasions in American history when the fate of the republic was placed at risk. He says, the first, the Civil War, when President Abraham Lincoln famously described the sectional conflict over slavery as testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. The second, he argues, was the Great Depression, when we survived under the leadership of FDR and his revised contract between democracy and capitalism called the New Deal. You maybe could argue for other moments as well, but clearly there have been times when our country has awakened to the brokenness of our covenant and then found a way somehow to very imperfectly renew that covenant. In November 2016, I was living in Vancouver, British Columbia. As people joked about how relieved we must have been to have moved to Canada just in time, I remember thinking it was so strange, really, not a relief at all, more like watching your home burn from across the street, helpless to save the precious and beautiful things inside. And 2 years later, as I prepared to leave, to move back here and begin working with you, I remember telling them up there about returning home to the place I grew up in, a country that has so often seen itself as a beacon for the vision of world community, a beacon of that vision of a pluralistic, democratic society. All the way back to the early colonist John Winthrop quoting Jesus' Sermon on the Mount as he declared to his fellow colonists, "We must always consider that we shall be as a city upon the hill. The eyes of all people are upon us." And you know, John F. Kennedy famously reusing that image, that shining city upon the hill. And of course, for Ronald Reagan as well. And while our country has never lived up to this image, it has nevertheless played a significant role in the moral imagination of people around the world. And sadly, right now, for people around the world, I think the United States of America looks more like a McMansion crumbling on a live fault line than that shining city on the hill. It's certainly possible that we are witnessing the early days of the fall of the American empire. And it's also possible that we are at a moment when we shall renew the covenant. Renew it to include voices that have been silenced and erased. Renew it to care for lives that have been devalued and debased. Renew it to affirm the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Renew it with a planetary awareness at the center. Renewing it to save our democracy and our climate both at once, to soothe our sin-sick souls as we begin to repair 4 centuries of racial injustice. My colleague Gretchen Haley writes that covenantal theology doesn't just say that we become human through our promising, but also we become human when we break those promises and yet somehow find ways to reconnect and begin again. When we repair the relationship because we know we need each other, even when we think the other isn't doing enough, even when our partner is annoying us or isn't listening well, isn't doing the things we want them done, even then when we realize then that we are still in it together. We can't give up. So return and begin again. It is this beginning again is what it means to be human. Over the last few years, there's been a movement afoot to renew the covenant we hold as Unitarian Universalist congregations. The idea is to add an eighth principle, currently drafted like this. We covenant to affirm and promote journeying toward spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions. A covenant to affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions. We've been engaged in this work for decades, but with sometimes shameful results. Our covenant remains broken. I know it's a mouthful, and perhaps the final version will be shorter and crisper, or maybe not, but isn't it time to place a commitment to dismantling racism and other oppressions, to building a diverse, multicultural, beloved community at the heart of our faith's promises? Isn't it past time? It is time for the pilgrim in me to travel in the dark, to learn to read the stars that shine in my soul. I will walk deeper into the dark of my night. I will wait for the stars, trust their guidance. Let their light be enough for me. May it be so, and amen.
for the gift of life and the many ways we are blessed, and for the generosity that sustains this religious community and blesses our world, we offer our thanks.
Amen. Thanks, Annis. And for time's sake today, we'll sing now our closing song, Circle Round for Freedom, and have a chance then to connect in breakout rooms for those who wish to stay for a virtual coffee hour. So if you'd reach out your hands or reach out your heart, let us be connected as we sing together, Circle Round for Freedom.